the economic consequences and the potential irreversible instability that would have been brought about if the war continued, if the straits remained closed for another couple of weeks, have been openly acknowledged by President Trump. In one of his more lucid explanations of what happened, he said that the U.S. strategic oil reserve had been depleted down to about 4 weeks. Others say it was closer to 2 weeks, and that the consequences of a further shutting of the Straits of Hormuz would have, in his own words, created the conditions, quote, for a global depression.
Well, welcome back to the Heroes Path podcast. I'm Colonel John Fenzel. This past Wednesday at the Palace of Versailles, Emmanuel Macron watched Donald Trump put pen to paper on a 14-point memorandum of understanding with Iran. Macron leaned in and said bravo to President Trump. Trump told reporters it's signed. He got back to his phone and he posted 4 words to the world: ships of the world, start your engines. Today is Friday. The IRGC broadcast a warning on maritime radio to every vessel in the Persian Gulf: don't approach the Strait of Hormuz. Any ship that does will be targeted. So just within 48 hours, that's the gap between start your engines and you'll be targeted. And we're going to be talking about this. This is a long way from being the end of a war, and we'll get into the details. And there's a lot of other news this past week. U.S. and Iranian negotiators had scheduled the first formal nuclear and final deal talks in Switzerland today, but that trip by Vance is canceled. The White House calls it logistics. Iran calls it Israel strikes against Lebanon. So we'll talk about those as well. Different answers. 18 Lebanese civilians were killed in Israel's deadliest strikes since the MOU was signed. 4 Israeli soldiers died when a tank was hit, and a Lebanon Hezbollah ceasefire was brokered this morning by the U.S., Qatar, and Iran, and that took effect at 9 o'clock Eastern time this morning. We're going to talk about a poll that was conducted through Wednesday. It found that 34% of Americans approve of the president's handling of Iran. Ted Cruz went on his podcast today and called $300 billion of reconstruction funds a giveaway to a lunatic regime. And so we'll talk about Ted Cruz a little bit. But Jeff Steinberg has been with us every week of this war. He's been right every single week. He's given us some great insights. Tonight he tells us what all of this means and what a ship captain in the Persian Gulf is supposed to do with 2 contradictory orders from the same government. So, Jeff, thanks very much for coming back and being with us again.
It was a pleasure, John.
All right. So let's talk about this. Walk us through what was actually in those 14 points and, most importantly, what was left out.
I think the 14 points make a number of things critically clear. Number one, that, and it's in the very first item, and I think it's important that it's included in the first item. Lebanon is included in the ceasefire and the overall agreement to bring the war to an end. That's the real reason why Vice President Vance did not get on a plane and fly to Switzerland for the Friday scheduled meeting, because the Israelis absolutely committed to sabotaging this whole agreement, carried out major strikes inside Lebanon. And so the Iranians, I think, are rightly putting pressure on President Trump to basically deliver that Israel will fall into line and in compliance with this agreement. It's there in black and white. A lot of other things are frameworks. The issue of aid, the $300 billion figure that people like Ted Cruz are jumping on, has actually been discussed from the standpoint of an overall Gulf fund of $300 billion to basically reconstruct after the war. And the whole idea of a kind of integrating of Iran into the region in a way that the reconstruction is in Iran, in the GCC countries, and even further abroad into countries like Jordan that were hit. Obviously, Lebanon may be a part of this. A lot of these details are really yet to be worked out. They've got a 60-day framework to do it. I think, ironically, if you wanted to say who got this right overall, the first name that comes to my mind is James Carville. back from his 1992 It's the Economy Stupid, because from both the U.S. and the Iranian standpoints, the economic consequences and the potential irreversible instability that would have been brought about if the war continued, if the straits remained closed for another couple of weeks, have been openly acknowledged by President Trump. In one of his more lucid explanations of what happened, he said that the U.S. strategic oil reserve had been depleted down to about 4 weeks. Others say it was closer to 2 weeks, and that the consequences of a further shutting of the Straits of Hormuz would have, in his own words, created the conditions, quote, for a global depression. And he said, Herbert Hoover was a great guy, but I don't want my name associated with Herbert Hoover experience of bringing on a Great Depression. So the U.S. was operating under those pressures, not just in terms of the U.S. economy, but the global economy. And inside Iran, the consequences of the blockade were creating the conditions which is the greatest fear of the IRGC and the clerics, those who are still in power in Iran, namely that economic hyperinflation, failure to provide adequate food supplies, things like that. That's the potential trigger for the kind of protests that erupted twice in the last couple of years, and really were the things that threatened the regime. So in a certain sense, both the Trump administration and the Iranians shared a common interest in overcoming what were becoming extraordinarily dangerous economic circumstances that posed a pretty grave national security threat to the Iranian regime and a threat to President Trump from the standpoint of the midterm elections, the state of the U.S. economy, and not somebody associated with an experience like Herbert Hoover and the Great Depression.
Jeff, let's get back to what's not in the document. What's not in the document, I think we don't have any mention of an enrichment ban, a verified mechanism for the highly enriched uranium removal, IAEA access rights beyond supervision of the downblending process, any requirement for Israel to withdraw from Lebanon, any mention of Israel at all. The administration's position is that this is the floor, not the ceiling, and Iran's position is that it achieved everything it wanted. These two positions are both accurate descriptions of the same document, but the nuclear commitment is not new. It's a new commitment they've been making for 50 years.
Right. And of course, if you look at the annual global threat assessments that are produced every year by the National Intelligence Council, the composite body of the entire U.S. intelligence community, they've made clear for quite a number of years that you had the original Khamenei fatwa that Iran will not develop a nuclear weapon. You had IAEA inspections. The U.S. intelligence assessment every year has been that while the Iranians certainly have the capability to move rather rapidly and aggressively towards a nuclear weapon, that they're not doing it. The wording within points number 10 or 11 or 12, somewhere in there, specified that the IAEA inspectors will be back on the ground, not just overseeing basically the watering down of the 60% enriched uranium. And I think the fact of the matter is that I was encouraged about 10 days ago. I may have mentioned this the last time that we spoke, that Witkoff and Kushner and some other people spent several days at Oak Ridge, which is the national lab, which has the greatest amount of knowledge base about nuclear weapons, nuclear proliferation, and the kind of regimen that would be required if you're going to negotiate something serious about genuinely curbing and curtailing and have written guarantees into the language of stopping Iran from making any kind of dash towards a nuclear weapon. At the same time, the Iranian argument is that they're signatories on the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They've announced that they plan to expand the development of commercial nuclear energy. They're talking about building 4 or 5 additional plants. over the next decade. And so they've got basically the weight of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but that also requires an enormous amount of hands-on inspection by the IAEA. So these are the details that are presumably to be worked out over the next 60-day period. So to my mind, again, the overriding driving motive between the Iranian side and the U.S. side has been to get out of what threatened to be a major looming economic catastrophe.
Right.
And so I think the real world situation is that everybody's watching to see whether or not Trump prevails over Netanyahu or Netanyahu prevails over Trump. Frankly, the Israelis have openly said that they have no intention of abiding by the agreement. The defense minister, Katz, openly said that they're not going to diminish in the least their operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon. So President Trump's going to really have to put his foot down hard on Netanyahu's neck. Otherwise, we're going to be having a conversation a week or two from now that the shooting is back on and we're back to the races again with the Straits of Hormuz shut down again and all of the consequences they're trying to avoid back on the table.
Let's talk about the Hormuz situation. Today, it's probably the most consequential development since the signing. But before you get into that, Jeff, give our listeners the baseline. What does the waterway actually look like over the past, 112 days or so? I know that before the war, you had roughly 153 vessels transiting through the strait daily. Where are we at now today?
Over the last 100 days, a few hundred ships have passed through. So maybe we're talking several days equivalent of ships passing through. Those were ships that were pre-approved by the Iranians, were moving towards destinations of countries that the Iranians have good relations with. We don't know all of the ins and outs, the details of what's been paid by way of transit fees, but presumably something. And it's a trickle of what it was beforehand. And as we know, there are a lot of real-world logistics that are going to go in. Let's say that the Straits of Hormuz are fully open as of today or tomorrow, that President Trump forces Israel to abide by the Lebanon ceasefire, and this thing goes forward. And of course, it's been signed by President Trump and by President Pezeshkian of Iran. The new supreme leader has said that he gave his okay to it because there were people who strongly favored it, while there were others, including the IRGC, who strongly opposed it.
That's interesting, Jeff, because I sense there's this massive fault line between the IRGC and the foreign ministry, right? The IRGC closed the strait to maritime traffic today. Iran's foreign ministry said it was open. Same government, same waterway, same day. So is this a miscommunication? I suspect it's not. I suspect that they've got some of their own internal issues that they're trying to navigate.
They certainly do. And I think the one common denominator issue is that it's the IRGC, it's the Quds force within the IRGC that utilize assets like Hezbollah, like Hamas, like the Houthis, like the units that are Shia militias inside Iraq. Those had historically been used as the kind of buffers against direct Israeli attack on Iran. And so the IRGC has the greatest interest in making sure that Hezbollah survives and continues to be a source of threat, particularly to northern Israel. But I think in fairness, President Trump's going to be facing a similar situation on the home front. You already mentioned Senator Ted Cruz. The Democrats are salivating over the idea that this could be a big issue for them in terms of the November elections. You cited the 34% approval for the handling. Of course, many of those people in that percent who don't think he handled it well thought that it began with the fact that he aligned with Israel and went to war in the first place. So those are not all people who think we stopped too soon. I would guess the majority of them opposed getting into this in the first place. So there's going to be opposition. And of course, like the JCPOA, this document doesn't require congressional approval. It's not a treaty. Congress can scream and yell and do all of those things that they're clearly already doing, but they don't have a voice in this unless they want to start shutting down the Pentagon budget or something like that, which they're certainly not prepared to do.
Yeah.
And on both sides, I think that the IRGC has to be careful about how much they try to bully the elected government. The deceased supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, engineered the election of Pezeshkian and wanted to have a counterweight to the increasingly hardline factions within the IRGC. And so the IRGC can't simply ignore the foreign minister, the president, people who are on the Supreme National Security Council. And so there's a kind of a balancing act both in Washington and in Tehran. The fact of the matter is that a number of people in the administration, Vice President Vance, Koff, Kushner, they were strongly pushing the idea of the deal. Rubio and others opposed it. So the fault lines politically exist in both countries. It can be a lot harsher and a lot more violent in Iran than it is in Washington. But I think in both cases, if it holds and they do move into the 60-day negotiating period, then at least I would say there is a possibility. I wouldn't give it a majority possibility, but there's a possibility that this thing holds because of the consequences of going back to war on both sides.
Let's talk about Switzerland, Jeff. The White House has said that the reason why Vance is not going is because of the logistics. Iran predictably said it was because of Lebanon. Walk us through what happened and what that gap is between those two answers and what it means.
I think the answer is clearly Lebanon, and the logistics issue that they referred to in Washington is that the Iranians said they're not going to go until the Lebanon issue is resolved because it's an issue number one in the signed MOU, which has Trump's signature and Pezeshkian's signature. And so when the Iranians said, we ain't going, their delegation was ready to get onto a plane until the Israelis pulled this attack on Lebanon. And one man's logistics is another man's strategic developments vis-a-vis the Lebanon front. And the argument that was made earlier today in Washington was that the signing already happened. President Trump preempted a signing ceremony in Switzerland today by signing it at the G7 summit meeting on Wednesday, and Pezeshkian signed it as well. This is the day of electronic signatures. You don't have to be anywhere near the same place to sign a document. It's kind of like a mortgage.
It's all falling into place there. But Jeff, let's talk about the week ahead. Three things I think that we're going to be wanting to watch in the next 7 days. First of all, which part of Iran, which elements of Iran control the strait, the foreign ministry or the IRGC, whether those talks in Switzerland are going to happen, what they can open with. And all those matter because, especially when it comes to the markets, oil closed today on that optimism about the MOU. The IRGC's closure broadcast was issued this afternoon. And what this means is that if we do end up with an MOU kind of falling apart, then crude oil could easily go back to $100 a barrel and gas prices could stop falling. And then that repricing would reach the gas pumps within probably, 10 days or so. So there's a lot still happening. I would say anything else that we should be on the lookout for in the next week?
I think the reality principle, which occasionally Trump being a highly undiplomatic person, and he said it, and it was really one of the alarm bells that was ringing all this past week. U.S. down to 4 weeks at most of strategic reserves. And if the straits remain closed, then we're going to be pretty soon reaching that 0 point. And at that point, oil's not going to stay at $100 a barrel. It's going to spike to 200 or 250 because of outright supply shortages on a global scale.
Yeah.
So I think that the weight of that carries a great deal of significance. And we're going to see, again, over the next week between Trump and Netanyahu, who's going to be calling the shots on this next critical moment. Vance said earlier today, since the document's already signed, the MOU is in force as of today, and now you've got this hopefully sustained ceasefire in Lebanon, they can fly over the weekend, they can come on Monday. So it could be something that the media is jumping all over because there's an enormous amount of opposition that's going to come from all kinds of directions. I had a conversation the other day with a friend who's been in the U.S. intelligence community for decades. And he just said he's never seen a situation where the mainstream media has gotten it so wrong that they're clueless as to what is really going on here. And they've got their 24-hour news cycle to keep feeding. So I'm taking a bit more of a wait and see approach. If there is a meeting by early part of this coming week in Geneva, if that Lebanon ceasefire holds, and that's going to require Trump having his knee on Netanyahu's throat on a pretty continuous basis. Does he have it in him to do that? To my mind, that's one of the most important questions to be watching closely over the next 7 days.
When you take all this and combine it, Jeff, and you ask yourself, what does it mean? Somewhere in the Persian Gulf right now, you have a tanker captain that's received two messages. One says that the Strait of Hormuz is open. The other one says the ship's going to be targeted if it approaches. And he's not reading an editorial. He's not reading any of the main media reports. He's making a decision, and that decision is whether to move or to anchor. And so this is the product of this 112 days of war that we've had so far. A signed MOU in Versailles, Macron's Bravo, Trump's Truth Social, Ted Cruz's podcast, Vance's canceled flight, all the red lines that have come down to tonight.
Yeah.
That tanker captain doesn't have the luxury of waiting for this 60-day negotiation to resolve it. And that's really, I think, going to be what you're waiting to see is
exactly
how is that going to end up? Are these ships actually going to be picking up and delivering oil, right?
And remember, the owners of that ship are consulting with their insurance companies about whether, if they move towards the straits, whether their insurance is going to be actually good.
Yeah, maybe we could get somebody from Lloyd's of London on here to talk to us.
Not a bad idea.
Jeff,
they're pretty busy right now.
Well, I'm sure they are, yeah. 16 weeks, every week, you've been right and given us some tremendous insights. So thank you for being here. And we talked a little bit about this. We're going to keep going because it's not over.
Absolutely.
Anybody who thinks this war is over is really, I think, sorely mistaken. And right now we're firmly in the kind of the crisis and conflict resolution stage of this war. And that part's not over with. To our listeners, the deal is signed. The strait is disputed. The talks haven't started yet. The clock is running. So watch those ships. This is Colonel John Fenzel. Thanks for listening to the Heroes Path podcast. Bye now.